One of the most important concepts in all programming, regardless of language, is variables. I'm going to try and explain this first through the context of an analogy, and then I'm going to show how it works in Python. So first things first is you need to understand that a variable is a container for a value or multiple values. It's a location in memory that you can call whenever you want to return said values. Now, the best way to think about it is if you think of it in terms of a box. So if you imagine you had a box and you could call that box whatever you wanted to. So you could give it a name and then we can store things in that box. You're meant to give your variable a name that helps you remember what's inside it. Because when you do larger programs in the future, you're going to have lots of variables at the same time. So it's really important you remember what you've put in every one. Now, once you've given the box an appropriate name, you can then take some data and you can put that in it. So for example, I'm going to take the name Dave and I'm going to put Dave in the box. Now, throughout my program, whenever I refer to the variable name, it will return what's inside the box. So in this example, it would return Dave. Now, you need to be careful because a common mistake I see people do is they create a variable, they store something in it, and then they store something else in the same variable, and they've lost what was originally in that box. If you put something new in the box, it overwrites what was previously in that box. So that's really important to know. And it's called a variable because it varies, because you can change what's inside it, hence the name variable. So now let's take a look at variables in the context of Python. So first things first is you need to create a variable, and you do that just by writing a name. I'm going to call this variable name. Then on the right hand side, after an equals, you need to give it some data. So the equals is an assignment operator. What that's going to do is it's going to put the data that's on the right hand side into the variable we've created on the left. So we've now created a variable and we've entered some data. To get that variable to output, we're going to use something called the print function. We will go into more detail about this later. So if I write print name and I press run, you can see it's outputted the name Dan. If I change that to Dave and I run it again, you can see the output changes. So I've got a variable here, it's location in memory that I've given a name. Wherever I reference that in my code, it's going to return the contents. So the mistake that I explained earlier is that if you then use that same variable name later in your code and give it a different value, when you call it, it's only going to return what's in the variable at that point in time. So Python, unless you tell it otherwise, is going to read my code like a book. So on line 2, I've put Dave inside the variable. And then on line 4, I've put Sally inside the variable, effectively replacing Dave. So then on line 6, where I print name, it's going to output Sally because Dave no longer exists. That is in essence variables. The only other two things I wanted to quickly show you was that the name itself is not important. If I called it XYZ, it would still work. And it would still output, so this would still output Dave. However, that breaks the good coding practice that I'd like to teach, where you have named variables that hold some meaning to what the data is inside. So you've got to have meaningful variable names, because that's just good coding practice. The other thing you might see is where more than one variable has been assigned on the same line. So for example, you could have name, comma, age equals Dan, comma, 5. So what we've got there is we've got two variables, name and age, where they've been given the values in the same order. So Dan has gone into name and 5 has gone into age. And then I can use these in my code just like I would have done otherwise. So if I print age, you can see it prints out the number 5. but it's just a slightly different way of assigning them instead of doing one line each. It's absolutely fine to do them on separate lines, but if you ever see me do this in any videos or you see it in any code, that works exactly the same way. It's just a way to assign multiple variables on the same line. And the final thing to explain is that when you name a variable, you are only allowed a single word. So you can't have my name equals Dan. You're not allowed that. So you've got two choices, because often when you're having meaningful variable names, you've obviously got to sometimes use multiple words to help explain what they are. So the best way is to use camel case. So that's where you use multiple words, but the first letter of each word is a capital. So it's referred to as camel case because it's still very easy to read. The other thing some people do is they might leave it all lowercase and they use underscores like that, and that's still absolutely fine. But there are two ways of using multiple words in a variable name because you're not allowed spaces. It's still got to act like a single word. And that in essence is everything to do with variables.